Well, I want to start off tonight just by sharing with you a really unfortunate decision that I made during my sophomore year here at Texas A&M University. I was home in Dallas over the Christmas holidays, and there was this girl that I wanted to ask out. She also lived in Dallas, but she went to Texas A&M. The only thing was that I wanted to ask her out, but she was the younger sister of one of my fraternity brothers, and he was this 6'6", tall, intimidating guy. His name was and is Brian. I wanted to ask out Brian's sister, and I wanted to somehow ask his sister out without him knowing. I don't know why I thought that was a good idea, but that's the idea that I had, and so I went with that. So I was home in Dallas over the Christmas break. I didn't have her phone number, and so I called my friend Ryan, not Brian, that's the name of the girl's brother, but I called my friend Ryan, who had her number. He gave me her number, and I wrote it down on a piece of paper because here's the deal. Cell phones existed back then, but this was still a time where we wrote numbers down, and we still called home lines. It was a very primitive time, people. I understand that. But that's just what I was dealing with. And so Ryan gave me her number, and he said, "Hey, TA, after you call her, call me and just tell me how it went." So I said, "Okay, great." I got off the phone. I picked up my phone. I looked at the paper. I dialed her number. I wiped my pitters. It rang, and I was calling her home line in Dallas because I didn't have her cell number. I was calling her home line. Well, guess who answered the phone? Brian. Brian answered the phone. And I was like, "Oh, geez. Hey, Merry Christmas, Brian. 'Tis the season." I was like, "Hey, is your sister home?" He was like, "No, she's not." I was like, "Cool." I didn't want to talk to her anyway. And Brian and I talked for just a little bit longer, and then I quickly hung up and got off the phone. And I was super nervous in that moment. I mean, just my heart was pumping. There was adrenaline through my veins. And I remembered. I was like, "Oh, my friend Ryan wanted me to call him back and just tell him what happened." And so dialed the number. He answered, and man, I just let him know everything. I was like, "Hey, Ryan, I called." But it was weird because Brian answered the phone. I didn't want him to know that I was calling to ask her out, and so I just kind of quickly got off the phone, and it was just kind of awkward. And then something interesting happened because here's what I heard from the other end of the phone. "Wait, this is Brian." And it was in that moment that I realized that I was so nervous that when I got off the phone the first time with Brian, I became fixated on the piece of paper on the table that had the phone number on it. So when I just started dialing numbers, I just dialed the number that was on the paper, thinking that I was calling my friend Ryan when I was actually just calling back Brian. So, men in the room, I'm in a moment here. This is a situation. I'm stranded in a moment with Brian. And so I'm just sitting there, we're sitting in silence, and I'm like, how am I gonna handle this? I had a whole conversation in my head while Brian is sitting quietly on the other end of the line, and I was like, I wanna handle this in a godly way. So check, I'm gonna be godly. Okay. Number two, I wanna do it in a manly way. Okay, check, gonna do it in a manly way. And so I just figured, what's the most godly, manly thing that I could do in this moment? So here's what I did. "Well, cool, man, I'll talk to you later." And I hung up the phone, and that was the end of it. Brian and I have not talked about that phone call to this day, and I never asked that girl out again. It was a fail, I'll tell you that. It was a fail during my college career. And I spent the rest of that day just kind of with this gnawing feeling inside of me of I can't believe I did that. What was I thinking? If I could just rewind and go back and not do that. It was a fail. It was just one of those moments in college that I look back and I'm like, "Oh, what was I thinking? I wish I hadn't done that." But I was over it after a day. Unfortunately, there's other decisions that I made during my time in college and even after college that aren't nearly as laughable. And I would look at them and say, yeah, they were definitely failures during college and even post-college. And when I look back on them, it's the same thought, it's the same feeling. What was I thinking? I can't believe I did that. If I could just go back and not do that. Because it didn't just take a day to get over them. There was guilt and there was shame that lingered around for months and in certain circumstances, even years afterward. And so I just want to talk about moments like that tonight. Like my goal tonight is to save you from some what was I thinking situations. Like that's my goal tonight. Just to be quite honest, I want to save you from the what was I thinking moments in life. And some of you hear that and you're like, this talk is too late. Like I could have really used this talk 2 months ago when I was with him or when I was with her or when I did that, but now it's about 2 months too late. And so there's kind of a shadow of shame that's been cast over your spring 2021, and you're living in the midst of the what was I thinking, I can't believe I did that kind of circumstances. And then others of you, you're on the way towards one of those circumstances. You're on your way to one of those moments because here's the reality, spring fever has set in on your fight against sin, and your heart has become calloused and you're just not as guarded, and compromise just doesn't seem like that big of a deal. And so you are operating in this mirage of life that feels like life, but in the end it's just leading you towards brokenness. And so my goal with you tonight is to kind of rattle your bones a little and say, hey, just let's wake up, to be kind of the boxing smelling salts, to wave under your nose and say, hey, would you snap out of it? Because what you think is life is actually death. And so I want to save you from some what was I thinking moments. We're going to do that just by stepping back into the life of David. We're going to look at his greatest failure. David is known for his greatest moment and his worst moment. He's known for killing a giant, and he's known for sleeping with another man's wife. So we're going to look at David's greatest failure. And what I'm going to do as we look into this moment, I'm going to give you 5 keys to avoiding a what was I thinking moment. So if you have a Bible, turn with me tonight to 2 Samuel chapter 11. 2 Samuel chapter 11 is where we're going to be. Just so you know where we're stepping into the life of David. David is about 50 years old when his greatest failure happens. Okay, he's about 20 years into his reign as king. And here's the reality, he is crushing it as king, period. Like he's just crushing it as king. Like we find this out in 2 Samuel chapter 8. Here's what it says about David. It says, and the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. So David reigned over all Israel. And David administered justice and equity to all his people. Do you hear what it's saying? David only won. Like, I don't know if you knew this, but DJ Khaled actually wrote the song, All I Do Is Win. It's based on the life of David. I don't know if you knew that. I'm totally joking. That's not true at all. It'd be awesome if it was. But this is David's life. Like everybody's hands go up and they stay there. That was David. All he does is win, win, win. So that is what we're stepping into. He only wins. He executes justice. Everyone loves him. Tons of power, tons of fame. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him in all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. 5 keys to avoiding a what was I thinking moment. Number 1, you want to take heed. Take heed. Like that's actually language just straight out of the Bible. To take heed means to pay attention. It's to wake up. It's to It's to beware. Like, walk carefully, take heed. I want you to think about it. David was considered the man after God's heart. Like, he was God's man, and even he fell. Like, if David was capable of falling, surely we are as well. Do you realize that? Like, do you realize that you're just one weak moment away from failure? We all are. It doesn't matter who you are, and because of that, my encouragement to you is to take heed. That's what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. He says, therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall. He's saying, don't be proud. Don't think that you're above that. Take heed. Let me just tell you two things that I learned from David's life regarding taking heed. Number one, take heed when things are really bad and things are really good. Like, be very, very careful. Pay attention when things are really bad, because when things are bad, our tendency is to blame God and then pacify our pain with sin. That's our tendency. But when things are really good, our tendency is to forget God and coast spiritually. That's what happened with David in this moment. I mean, look back at the text. Look at the type of day that he's having. For some, like, this is your Saturday that David is having. What does it say? Verse 2, it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch. Some of y'all are going to claim that like as your life verse. You're like, the Bible has never made more sense to me than right now. Like, late one afternoon when I got off my couch. Like, David gets me. Like, this is your verse, people. But he's having one of those days where he's just too comfortable. Like, he is coasting. He was too relaxed. Here's the thing. All of his army was off fighting the Ammonites, but David wasn't fighting the Ammonites. He didn't go to battle with the Ammonites, and he wasn't going to battle against his true enemy, the devil, or his own flesh. See, we have to realize, and some of you guys hear me talk about the devil, and you're like, okay, this dude's crazy, but here's the reality. There is a spiritual realm that we cannot see, and there are forces at play in this world that are against you. And the Bible would refer to that leader as the devil, and he hates you, and he wakes up every day with his intention is to steal from you, and he is consistently lying to you about the goodness of God. And so you just need to know that. So every day when you wake up and you put your feet on the ground, you're actually stepping onto a battlefield. Like, you have an enemy that is strategically thinking about how to take you down. But often we wake up and we believe that we're on a cruise ship instead of a battlefield. And so often we fail to go to battle with our true enemy, and we fail to go to battle against our own flesh, because here's just the reality, people. Like, if you know Jesus Christ, the Bible is clear that you have been made new, that you are a new creation, but you have to understand that this side of eternity, you'll always be a work in progress. Like, the Christian life is a fight. Like, you're going to still battle thoughts and desires and motives and words and actions that are not pleasing to God. You're gonna battle those for the rest of your life. Like, I don't know what you expected with the Christian life. I don't know if you thought you'd trust in Jesus and then you'd be perfect, and so you'd feel a lot of shame that you're not perfect. But the Christian life is a fight, and you are a work in progress. I don't know who you think I am standing on this stage, but you need to know every day I have to go to battle against sin in my own life. Thoughts or desires or motives in my heart or words on my tongue or actions being lived out through my life that are not honoring to the Lord. That's the way it is. It is a fight. So I'm just telling you, take heed when times are good and when times are bad. Wake up and fight. I remember when I was breaking free from pornography during my senior year at Texas A&M, I woke up every morning and I just prayed, God, I'm just 1 weak moment away from failure. And I prayed that just to remind myself, hey, I'm taking heed. I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh my gosh, I've gone months without looking at porn. That's pride. No, I'm going to say, God, thank you for victory yesterday, and I need it today. I need you just as much today as I needed you yesterday. I want to take heed. I'm just 1 weak moment away from failure. Also, take heed against a slow slide. Take heed against a slow slide. Like, failure is not usually a jump off of a cliff. Like, you rarely have your best day ever with Jesus and then land in adultery. Like, that doesn't normally happen. It's usually a slow slide, and you don't even realize that it's happening. David was on a slow drift from God when it came to women. Like, let me just read you something that was actually back in 2 Samuel chapter 5. This was when David was anointed king, but we see the glimpse of a slow slide in regard to women. It says this, and David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem. Doesn't that rattle you a little? Doesn't that verse feel out of place when we're talking about the man after God's own heart, that David took more concubines and wives? Why would he do that? Well, because it was culturally acceptable. Like, part of the way that nations would ratify treaties between one another is that the king might marry the daughters of the other nation, and the reason that they would do that is because the thought was you're less likely to go to war against extended family. And so David was doing something that was culturally acceptable, but back in Deuteronomy, God had spelled out his expectations of kings of Israel. No matter who the king was, Deuteronomy 17 says this, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. See, what David needed to realize is just because something is culturally acceptable doesn't mean that it should be personally acceptable. See, conformity to culture is the breeding ground for compromise. It is. And so let me just identify some things that are culturally acceptable here at Texas A&M and in Bryan College Station. Going to Northgate Thursday through Saturday, sending a pic or asking for a pic on Snapchat, watching certain shows on Netflix or HBO Max, or having a Tinder account, or gaming for 15 hours a day, or cussing, or getting high. These things are culturally acceptable, but just because they're culturally acceptable doesn't mean that they should be personally acceptable. If they are personally acceptable to you, it's possible that you're on a slow slide, and you just need to know that when you conform your life to culture, you have laid the groundwork for compromise that will result in massive failure. So the first key to avoiding a what was I thinking moment is simply this: take heed, like watch out, be careful, pay attention. Number two, it's this: remember who you are. Remember who you are. Look back at verse 1. Look at what it says. It says, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle. It was most common to conduct a military campaign in the spring just because the weather was most favorable at the time. But that's the time when kings go out to battle. Who is David? He is king. What should he be doing? He should be going out to battle. Instead, he sent Joab, that was his nephew and the commander of his army, and his servant with him, and all Israel. It's almost, you can hear in the author's voice, David sent the whole nation. David is the king of Israel. He sends all of Israel, but he doesn't go with all Israel. He's not where he is supposed to be. What does it say? But David remained at Jerusalem. See, his activity is not representative of his identity. Do you see that? David's identity is that he is king, but his activity is not in line with his identity. Do you remember what Acts 13:22 says about David? It says, and when he, that's God, had removed him, that's King Saul, He raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart who will do all my will. That was David's identity. He was a man after God's own heart. But here in chapter 11, his activity does not match up with his identity. So what we see is, at least in this moment, it's as if David is forgetting who he is. And I just need you to hear me. So much sin in our lives can be traced back to us just forgetting who we are and forgetting what our identity is when we know Jesus Christ. That, I promise you, let me give you an example. So David was king, and he was labeled the man after God's own heart. There's different labels that are placed on our lives when we put our trust in Jesus Christ. Probably the most significant one is the label of child. Like the Bible calls us children of God. That's the greatest news of Christianity. That if you don't know Jesus, you're actually not a child of God. The Bible would say that you are an enemy of God. And yet Jesus Christ went to the cross, he was put in a tomb, and he walked out of that tomb. Something so significant happened through his death, burial, and resurrection that Jesus made a way for us who were enemies to be adopted into the family of God. And now the God of the universe looks at us and calls us his children. Like, that is your identity. But so often we operate as orphans instead of children. Like, think about it. I assure you that so much of our sin can be traced back to a perceived deficiency of love in our lives, a perceived lack of love in our lives. And so we operate as orphans. What does an orphan have to do? An orphan has to fight for love. An orphan has to chase love. But what does a child do? A child simply sits in and enjoys and receives love. But so often we are chasing love or fighting for love. Just evaluate, trace your sin back to a perceived deficiency in love. Like, the reason that you might look at porn is because in a fantasy world, you're always acceptable. There is no rejection in pornography. And so you chase love. You wonder if you're desirable or if you are lovable. You step into a fantasy world, and at least for that moment, that fantasy person is saying yes. Or the reason that you give your body to a guy is because at least in that moment you feel lovable. The reason that you will lie to someone else or exaggerate is because you feel a need to control their impression of who you are. So if you're going to truly be acceptable to them, if they're truly going to like you and desire a relationship with you, then you have to manufacture some version of yourself that is most attractive. You see, you're operating like an orphan. But just imagine how different life would feel if you woke up in the morning and you just sat in your identity. Like, Jesus Christ gave his life to bring me into the family of God. So I know that God is willing to literally do anything for me. Like, I'm adopted into the family of God, which means God actually chose me. He didn't get stuck with me through natural birth. No, he chose me, and he set his affection on me. The Psalms say, our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases, which means that God only does what pleases him. And he chooses to father you and call you his son or his daughter because it gives him pleasure. So the God of the universe looked at you this morning and was like, I delight in you. My pleasure is so for you. And even in the midst of our sin, even in the midst of our failure, he's chasing us with his love. Like, every single day when we wake up, his love is there, and it is so full. Like, we could never do anything to make him love us less. There's nothing we could do to make him love us more because his love for us is maxed out. Can you imagine how different your activity would be if you lived according to your identity? So you have to remember who you are. Let me give you another example. Like all throughout the New Testament, struggle. All throughout the New Testament, Christians are referred to as saints. Have you ever thought about yourself as a saint? Like if you know Jesus, you're Saint Mike or Saint Catherine. Like you're a saint. I don't know if you knew that. Like the Bible calls you a saint. Do you know what that word in the Greek? It literally means just holy. Have you ever thought about yourself like that? Have you ever thought of yourself as holy? Like you're holy. In God's sight, that's who you are. You're a saint. You're holy. Here's what that means. It means that Jesus' work on the cross, his sacrifice on the cross, did something so significant that he was able to make us holy in the sight of God. Like you and me are able to stand as holy individuals in the sight of a God who is holy, holy, holy. And we can actually live with him for all of eternity. But so often we operate like our identity is that we're just normal college people. Well, that's just what college people do. All college people struggle with that. I'm just struggling with what all college people struggle with. Here's the problem. If you know Jesus, you're not just a normal college student. You are holy. You are a saint. You know what this means? It means that you have far more in common with God than you do the unbeliever sitting next to you in your class. Because God has transformed you overnight. You might not feel it. Your life might not look new, but he has made you new. Specifically, he has made you holy in God's sight. If you just begin to own that as your identity, if you begin to see yourself as a saint, you know what? It would change things. You begin to say, you know what? This really isn't fitting for the life of a saint. Like if I'm holy in God's sight, I gotta get rid of this junk. Like this has no place in my life. Because I'm not just a stereotypical college student. I'm a saint. I've been made holy by God. So you have to remember who you are. You know when being a Christian becomes miserable? I wonder if I'm describing anyone in this room. You know when becoming a Christian becomes miserable? It's when Christianity or the Christian life is just about not sinning. So the Christian life boils down to not looking at porn or not having sex or not getting drunk. But all the while, you want to look at porn, you want to have sex, and you want to get drunk. That's a miserable existence. See, the normal Christian life can be boiled down to simply living out your identity. That's it. That's what the Christian life is. It's living out your identity. Because when you live out your identity will determine your activity, and the result will be conformity to the image of Christ. And you'll look more like Jesus. And you'll enjoy Jesus because he's the one who brought you into the family of God. You'll enjoy God the Father because he looks at you and loves you and delights in you as his child. And you'll enjoy the Spirit who is working inside of you, making you more like Jesus. So you have to remember who you are. Number 3, really quickly, exit before entertaining. Like exit before entertaining. Here's the reality. This story could have gone a totally different way. The story could have gone, David takes a walk on the patio, he sees a naked woman bathing, she's very beautiful, and he goes for a jog. David saw a beautiful woman, she was naked, and he took a cold shower. David saw a beautiful woman, and he ran and told his wife. But no. He had the option. He came to a crossroads, and at that crossroads he could either exit or he could have entertained the sin. Just watch the verbs. Like verbs, the verbs just pile up. Watch how they pile up. Verse 3. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. There's 5 different verbs describing David's action. See, the verbs just piled up. Here's just a good rule to live by. When you are tempted, you only want one verb after the temptation. That's it. She was tempted, and she ran. He was tempted, and he ran. That's it. You want one verb after the temptation, but you can be confident that the more verbs that you allow to be written into the story of your temptation, the lower the chances of you making it out clean. I mean, just think. He sat alone in his apartment. He scrolled. He scrolled some more. He scrolled some more. Just verbs piling up. She thought about it. She took a few more pics. She deleted them. She retook them. She sent them. He got angry. He rehearsed it over and over in his mind. He composed a text. He pressed send. He punched a wall. You see the verbs just piling up? You have a choice. You can either exit or you can entertain. But there's always an opportunity to exit. We know that because of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. It says, "No temptation has overtaken you that's not common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation," watch this, "He will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure." Do you see that? God is promising through Paul, there will always be a way out. There was a way out for David. I mean, he could have ran. Even when he sent for a messenger, what'd the messenger say? "Dude, that's another man's wife, isn't it?" That's God like, "Hello, McFly," like, wake up, snap out of it, David. This is another man's wife. You're the guy after my heart. And here's the reality. You don't have to wait till the situation to find the way of escape. There's situations that you can just go ahead and avoid altogether. Like, I would just encourage you, sit with some friends and just think through, where are the places and who are the people that when I'm with them, it never goes well for me. Like, it's just been good. Let me just give you a few examples from my life. Number 1, I don't have hard conversations after 10 p.m. except with my wife because we live together and there's no way out. So if a hard conversation, and she's here tonight, I love you, Kat. It's just if I'm going to have a hard conversation, I'm going to have it with Kat, but no one else after 10 p.m. because I get foggy after 10 p.m. I can't think straight or communicate well. I don't send weighty texts or emails without having someone else read them. I don't watch shows that are TVMA unless I've researched them regarding sex. If I'm staying alone in a hotel, I don't turn on the hotel TV at night. It's just because I know my tendencies. And I expose things to friends. Like we get on Marco Polo and I'll just tell them, "Hey man, here's what I'm struggling with right now." Because when I expose something going on in my life, you know what it does is it reduces the power of it. And it just begins to cut off the supply to the sin. Exit before entertaining. Number 4, remember who they are. See, we talked about remembering who you are. Now I'm encouraging you, if you want to avoid a "what was I thinking" moment, then you have to begin to remember who they are. Look back at the text. Look back at verse 3 again. "And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, 'Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam?'" Do you know who Eliam was? Eliam was one of David's best warriors, one of his best fighters. And because we know that Bathsheba was Eliam's daughter, we now know who Bathsheba's granddad was. Do you know who her granddad was? It was David's most trusted advisor. And not only that, Bathsheba is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Do you know who Uriah was? Uriah wasn't just some random soldier amidst the tens of thousands. No, he was in David's inner circle. He was one of David's mighty men and most trusted warriors. And on top of that, Bathsheba, just the fact that she's a woman created in the image of God means that she's an image bearer. She has incredible value in worth and in dignity, and yet what David does when he sends for her and brings her to himself and lays with her, as he does that, you know what he's doing in his mind or through his actions? He is stripping Bathsheba of her identity, in her value, in her dignity. What I'm not saying is that David's actions diminished her worth. No, God's the one who determines Bathsheba's worth. Her value, her dignity is always intact as an image bearer of God. But I'm saying through David's actions, what his actions showed in terms of what was going on inside of him was that he was stripping her of her dignity, stripping her of her value, stripping her of her humanity. And her dad and her granddad and her husband were just details to David. See, when we sin, often that's what we do to other people. Like the gunman who killed 8 women in Atlanta, 6 of whom were Asian women. He killed them. Why? He killed them because he saw them as sources of temptation. In killing them, he dehumanized them. He stripped them of their value and dignity and whittled them down to just objects of temptation. My son was showing me the YouTube channel Mark Rober. I don't know if you've heard of this guy. He's fascinating to watch, but he's trying to expose all like the robo-caller, like scammer people who will hit people up for money. Instead of sending them money, he's sending them glitter bombs, like bombs that just explode all over them. When they open the box, a bunch of glitter and fart spray goes on them. It's truly remarkable to watch. He's going to take down the scammer industry. But he was just showing how the industry works and how these scammers prey upon the elderly and will end up getting about $20,000 from elderly people. And they manipulate the elderly. And my heart just sank as I watched it. Why? Because something in me knew this is wrong. These people are stripping the elderly of their humanity. They're stripping them of their identity. They're stripping them of their dignity and their value. They're just making them means to their end. When you gossip about someone, when you say horrible things about another person, you are stripping them of their value. When you look at porn, you're stripping someone of their value or dignity. They're no longer a human being made in the image of God. They're no longer someone that Jesus died to save. They are simply a means to your end. Guys, when you push past a girl's no, or when you ask her for pics over Snapchat, just remember who she is, because in that moment, you are acting like she is something lesser than you. In that moment, she exists for your needs. You have to remember who they are. And last, you want to avoid a what was I thinking moment. You just have to change your vantage point. Look at verse 5. What does it say? And the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. I wonder if David looked on the backside of sleeping with Bathsheba. I wonder if he knew, like, oh, we're going to sleep together. It's going to be an amazing night, but she's going to get pregnant. And then I'm going to have to spend a year trying to cover it up. I'm actually going to have her husband murdered just to cover this thing up. See, often all we can see is the moment of gratification. You have to change your vantage point. You have to begin to look at the backside of sin, because sin always has a backside. But the problem is when all you can see is gratification, the fog of sin rolls into your mind, and sin makes you stupid. Sin makes me stupid. And we believe that there is some scenario where we can enter into sin and get out of it with no consequences. There is no version of a story where it just all works out. As I was preparing for this, I just remembered a story of back in 2016, there was a student at Stanford that was convicted for sexually assaulting an unconscious woman at a fraternity party. And the reason that it made national news was because he got off light. Like, they didn't give him much of a sentence. But I just remembered that there was a quote that this kid's dad made about his son, who was the victimizer. And here's what he said about his son. He said, in terms of the thought of his son going to prison for an extended period of time, he says, that's a steep price to pay for 20 minutes of action out of his 20 plus years of life. What's his dad saying? 20 minutes of stupidity shouldn't shape the trajectory of my son's life. You know what the problem was? Is even the dad was stripping this girl of her worth and dignity and the fact that she was a woman created in the image of God. You need to understand, even 20 minutes of stupidity can shape the trajectory of your week, your month, your semester, your year, your college experience, and your life. And you know what? Not just your life. 20 minutes of stupidity for your life can shape the trajectory of the victims around you. And the devastation that girl endured because of this one kid's 20 minutes of stupidity. And so what you have to do is you have to begin to look at the backside of your sin. Just think about the morning after. Just think about what you will have to deal with on the other side of your sin, because it might just not be worth it. So what do we do with this? Let me just give you 3 things to do. Number 1, before you leave tonight, let me just encourage you to embrace God's grace over your failures. Maybe you're here tonight and you're sitting there saying, I've already failed. This message is too late. I want you to know that the grace of God is sufficient to cover over all your failures. When you get home tonight, let me just encourage you to meet with a trusted friend and to just expose sin to them. Like if there's any compromise in your life, just expose it to them, share that with them. And I want to encourage you to go so far as to share this in particular. Share with a trusted friend, if you were going to fall, what would it likely involve? Like what area of your life would it be in if you were going to fall? And then every day this week, let me just encourage you to take heed. Like remember who you are and remember who they are. And then let me just end by saying this. We've said this every week, but David points us to Jesus, and Jesus is the greater David. Well, David failed in time of temptation. Jesus Christ didn't. See, we often think that Jesus' greatest temptation was when he was in the desert and Satan was tempting him. That wasn't Jesus' greatest moment of temptation. His greatest moment of temptation is when he hung on the cross. And the crowds looked at him, and here's what they said to him. They said, if you are the Son of God, save yourself and come down from the cross. That was his greatest moment of temptation, because in that moment, Jesus could have come down from the cross. He could have shown himself to be the Son of God, but in doing so, he would have left all of humanity to endure the wrath of God on their own. Instead, he endured the temptation. And he emerged victorious. And in doing so, he secured salvation for all who would put their trust in him. All those who would repent and turn from their sin and turn toward Jesus Christ in real faith. And here's the great news. Jesus Christ went to the cross and he conquered Satan, sin, and death. And in doing so, he did that so that anyone who would put their trust in Jesus would receive his Spirit. That's the presence of Christ living in you through the Spirit who is at work in you now and helping you become more like Jesus so that you can be victorious in times of temptation. And yet, even in the moments when you're not, Jesus' work on the cross was so significant that he can take all of your failures and trade them for his forgiveness. Some of y'all need to hear that tonight, that you're not defined by what you've done. Like the banner over your life is not failure. You don't have to be defined by what you've done. You can be defined by what he has done. That's what Jesus Christ is in the business of doing. He's in the business of trading stories. He takes our stories of failure and gives us his story of forgiveness and favor. So the banner over your life is no longer failure. The banner of your life is forgiven. If you walked in here towing an anchor of shame and regret, leave it here. Because Jesus Christ has dealt with all of your failures, past, present, and future. You do not have to walk in shame. You can walk in joy and freedom, knowing that your King is good and he's dealt with your sin. Do you know him? Because that's the story of the gospel, that we have all failed in the eyes of God. And Jesus Christ has come that we might be forgiven.